history is always here with us. History is always informing us, even when we don't necessarily know that it is doing that, right? And there's a deep history of the cooperative movement here in Virginia and in the South, and it's a very significant history. So when we're thinking about who should keynote this first event, we reached out to somebody who is, without question, sort of the person who has done the most to unearth this history, to bring it forward, to inspire, as a result, action all over the United States. The number of people that I have run into in the last several years who have said, have you read Collective Courage? I've been on conference calls where this comes up repeatedly, right? Has been really impressive. And this is actually the text that we use to begin the Next System Studies seminar, Social Change in the Next System. And it's a very important grounding. Jessica Gordon Nembhard is Professor of Community Justice and Social Economic Development at the Department of Africana Studies at John Jay College of the City University of New York. She's an affiliate scholar at the Center for the Study of Cooperatives at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada, incidentally, where my aunt and uncle have been since my aunt followed a draft dodger to Canada a long time ago. So I've been to Regina. And actually, if you read her bio, there's a long history of work with all kinds of center for cooperatives all over the United States. So she's a political economist by training with degrees from University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and Yale, PhD, master's, obviously. Has written many articles, not only on the history of the cooperative sector and cooperative movement, but also on projects that are ongoing. But we're here today to talk about the theme of this text of collective courage, to learn from the examples of history, and also to tie the lessons from that to our projects today. So I ask you to please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Jessica Gordon Nembhard.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very excited to participate. Thanks. And sorry, I'm a little distracted. This is, I think, my first public speaking since COVID, and I'm trying to keep my 100-year-old father from germs. So that's why I'm staying away from everybody and trying to stay back and germ-free, so excuse me for that. But thanks for being here. Thanks, I don't know if they're still here, the land and water acknowledgement. Yes, excellent, thanks. I usually, let's see if I can get this. Yeah, I usually do one also, but I forgot about water, so I'm gonna start adding water now into mine, since it is so important. Thanks to the organizers, I'm really glad you were able to do this, and hopefully many more. And then also I always like to acknowledge ancestors, my own ancestors, your ancestors, invited them into the space to support us in all that we're doing. I always want to remember for mine, those who were enslaved, those who continue to labor without just compensation, those who practice resistance, especially through solidarity and collective economics. I also want to just in general recognize the struggles of all those combating anti-Blackness, racism, patriarchy, environmental degradation, etc., and also acknowledge any elders. And yesterday was Earth Day, so that's another reason to add the water issue, but I just wanted to remind us of Earth Day as well. So we're at a crossroads. I think we're starting to move toward the right fork in the road. But I wanted to remind you of something W.E.B. Du Bois, who hopefully you all know, a respected African-American scholar. But also, if you read my book, you know he was a proponent of cooperatives as an economic development strategy, especially for Black liberation. And he held a conference, I think it was one of the first conferences on Black co-ops in Atlanta in 1907. And the final statement from the conference is, well, paraphrased what's on the screen there. We unwittingly stand hesitating at the crossroads, one way leading to the old trodden ways of grasping fierce, individualistic competition to get wealth at the expense of the general well-being. The other way leading to cooperation in capital and labor, the massing of small savings, the wide distribution of capital, and a more general equality of wealth and comfort. So that was 115 years ago he said that, but I think we're still at that crossroads. I think we've been at that crossroads for 115 years, right? A few of us, some of us venture one way, too many of us venture the other way. And here we are again. And I think especially since COVID, more people are willing to sort of try the way of amassing wide distribution of capital and a more general equality of wealth and comfort, but we're still hesitating, right? And so hopefully this conference and the work you all do and will do will help us to move more toward that. And, you know, he's actually said these things in other eloquent ways too, but I just want us to think about the terminology, right? More general equality, wealth and comfort. So I usually talk to my students about community well-being, right? That we're in it for the general well-being, community well-being, right? Cooperation in capital and labor. So often in his lifetime, they talked more about consumer cooperatives, but he had labor in there. So he had a notion about worker cooperatives and producer cooperatives also. So I think we, we should be more proactive, right? It's been too long that we've been standing at these crossroads, and so let's figure out ways that we can get ourselves over. So for me, cooperative solidarity economics are a community economic development tool as well as an economic justice tool. So they serve multiple purposes, which is another reason why they're such a great tool, right? So they, in economics, we talk about market failure, right? When the market doesn't produce something. And hopefully you all know at this point that capitalist markets produce very little for the general well-being of human beings. And so we're always in market failure as far as I'm concerned, and people of color are always in market failure because the markets don't work for us and are meant not to work for us. So cooperatives help to address that, help to address underdevelopment, economic isolation, marginality, and on the positive side, to help to increase affordable goods and services, access to affordable goods and high quality goods and services, right? So they're also an anti-poverty strategy and a community building strategy. They help us to anchor and stabilize the local economy, which is another reason why I got excited when I first started learning about cooperatives. And they practice economic democracy, which of course is essential if we're thinking about what the next system is. And so what do we mean? What do I mean by economic democracy? I mean economic decisions and activity are people-centered rather than profit-centered. It's a grassroots economic framework based on solidarity and cooperation. We want to reduce hierarchy. We want to reduce dominance. We want to have multiple voices heard, multiple stakeholders participating together, right? And also workers and invisible laborers, right? We want them to have the voice, right? Them to be able to say what's happening in the economy, what kind of activity we should be doing, how much it should cost, how they're going to work together, what they should get paid, what should happen, right? So the democracy really isn't just about us as consumers, but it's really about us as consumers and workers, and having our say on both sides in terms of how we're going to socially reproduce ourselves and what's the economics that's going to bring us to that. And so then, of course, the goal, right, economic democracy is a strategy, right? The goal is justice, right? And what some of us are now calling the economics of abundance, right? We want economics not to be about scarcity, but about abundance, what we can create together to perfect our humanness and to allow our humanness, right, and allow Mother Earth to flourish, right? And so that's what economics should be about. So that's the goal, right? Economic exchanges and distributions are fair and equitable. The most number of people benefit and distributed abundantly. We eliminate exploitation and inequality, eliminate poverty, eliminate private monopoly and dominance of businesses that seek profit at the expense of human need. We want to build economies based on human values, the needs of society, eliminate need, enable prosperity for all, and that would get us to this human perfectibility and community well-being. So cooperatives, I don't know if I need to, I'll kind of fast forward on what they are. You can ask me if those of you who don't know what they are, but I think most of you here probably know already, right? Jointly owned companies, value-based, created to satisfy a need, governed through democratic economic participation, sharing risk, and sharing the surplus and the profits. During the year of cooperatives, 2012, oops, that didn't, the NCBA, National Cooperative Business Association here in the US, had a little contest on what makes your co-op rock. And then they put together this poster, the 10 reasons why co-ops rock. I'm not going to go through it all. Hopefully you guys can look at the visual quickly, but a lot of this stuff I already said is in there. The other piece that's important, especially for economists and economic development, is the lower failure rates of cooperatives, right? Most people don't realize or don't recognize how precarious business development is, and small businesses and especially actually fail, right? Most small businesses, about 60 to 80% of them fail in the first year. Cooperatives, only 10% fail in the first year. After 5 years in business, 90% of co-ops are still operating. Usually only 3 to 5 traditional businesses are still operating. So co-ops are actually a better viable business model if you look at it in that way. And if you think about all the things we just talked about, all the components, right? Membership, economic participation, democratic decision-making, all those things about being human and about making decisions together actually help the co-ops to have better longevity. We also know that co-ops survive crises better and actually are often created during a crisis, because the crisis, again, is that market failure, an excessive market failure, and we need a different model, and co-ops fill those gaps and fill those alternatives. So even in crises, co-ops are a better model and often develop out of the crises. And then, of course, the universality of co-ops. I guess it was 20 years ago now, maybe longer, when I first started studying about cooperatives and thinking about them as a community economic development strategy. People told me, Black people as well as white people told me, that Black people didn't do co-ops. And there was this weird mythology, you know, in the Black communities, there was a notion that co-ops were just sort of hippie food stores. They didn't realize that credit unions were co-ops. They didn't recognize other kinds of co-ops or know about them. And in the white community, there's just sort of more ignorance than anything else. Never made sense to me. I didn't understand why people talked about cooperative movements starting with the Rochdales in England. When I started studying it and then started learning more about solidarity economics, I realized that really solidarity economics, economic cooperation, and even official co-op businesses are universal. They're not just what Europeans do. They're not just what lefties do, right? And in fact, if you think about it, co-ops are actually the first kind of economic activity, the first method of economic survival from hunting and gathering, right? Hunting and gathering was always done with a group of people together and sharing, right? So really what happened with capitalism is that it alienated us from our notions of cooperation and collective work and responsibility. And it's time for us to what's the word? Gosh, I'm getting old here. To de-alienate ourselves. That's not the word I was looking for, but that's the word that's coming up, right? So it's time for us to reunite ourselves with, right? Unite our humanity with our economics. And that's, to me, what co-ops and solidarity economics does. And that's what the vision and the mission of the next system is, right? To reunite us with our humanity through our economics. Because so much, if you think about it, so much of our waking hours, right, are in these very hierarchical, exploitative jobs and work. And so therefore, most of our life is about being exploited or exploiting others, when really as human beings, that's not what we're about and that's not what our mission is. So why shouldn't we recreate economics for the mission of human perfectibility, right, and developing human beings? So that's really indigenous societies have always had that notion of the collective and the commons and the stewardship for the next generations, right? Early African civilizations have used co-ops, and then throughout the world, all groups have used co-ops. So we need to think of it more as a universal strategy. And then Ben already gave a plug for my book, so I won't say too much about that, but there also is a study I helped to do on current Latinx co-ops. That's the website there if you're interested in that study. We could probably re-show it to you later if you need to write it down or something. But I realized I'm going too long, so I wanted to get to some examples and then time for question and answers. So I covered hundreds of mutual aid societies, Black communal towns, examples of formal and informal economic cooperation from about 1780 to 2013 in African American communities. There's lots of similar activity going on in all other communities in the US, but my project, my interest was to look at what was happening in African American communities. I found about 162 legally incorporated cooperative enterprises, meaning once the US actually had laws for how to incorporate as a co-op. That's what I mean by legally incorporated co-ops, and that would have been the late 1800s when we finally had the laws. And then also Du Bois in his study, his 1907 study that he did for that conference, he found 20 credit unions and 154 co-ops that are separate from the ones that I found. So not a huge universe, but enough to show that there's a legacy and a history here. The other thing I wanted to mention, because it was, I realized that after I sort of put the book together, it turns out there are about 3 periods, and I think now we're probably entering a 4th period, that were the most prolific, especially for African American co-ops, but I think probably for co-ops in general in the US. So it's the 1880s, 1930s and 40s, and the 1960s and 70s. So what was similar about those periods, which will also help us to understand why I think we're in a period now and how that can help us move forward, right? First, survival needs, especially 1880s and the 1930s, right? 1930s was the Great Depression. 1880s was the end of Reconstruction, the beginning of white supremacist terrorism and Jim Crow segregation. And also the 1880s was a time of some economic challenges, which is usually one of the reasons why we end up with more racial repression during economic challenges. The 60s and 70s, the economy was better, so the survival wasn't as much, but there were active periods of racial consciousness and transition, just like the 1880s. So the 60s and 70s were similar to 1880s in terms of the racial consciousness raising and those activities. 1880s and 1960s were also similar in the need for economic independence, for political activism, for civil rights. A lot of civil rights workers in both those time periods found that when they were active, the mainstream economy retaliated against them and fired them or took their land away and things like that. And so there was a need for the co-op movement in both those periods. And then all 3 periods I found really fascinating. But when strong Black organizations were promoting cooperative alternatives and co-op education, that also it helps to explain periods of proliferation. And all 3 periods actually had very strong Black organizations promoting co-op development, even though, again, the history was a little bit lost and silent. So I want to focus on a couple of examples from those periods, but in general to let you know the accomplishments, right, where the goods, quality goods and services get provided, cost savings, which then allowed increasing incomes and wealth. The co-ops were actually used to combat racism, and you'll see some examples of that in a minute. They also increased economic stability and Black self-sufficiency. They saved and created jobs in communities. They provided independence and self-determination and developed leadership, which is also something I didn't realize. I should have noticed it as a political economist, but I didn't realize it till I interviewed the then executive director of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives about 15 or 20 years ago. And he was reminding me about all the leadership that gets developed when people are engaged in the co-op movement and in co-ops. Also, my children say I'm too much of a Pollyanna, so I try to put in a little bit about the barriers, but I figured I'll put it in now so we can focus on the successes before I finish. So barriers, some of the normal barriers to economic development and business development, but also some of the barriers are related to being co-ops in a capitalist world, right? So capitalization, access to capital, adequate and proper orientation and training. It turns out the education piece, both the formal and the informal education, is really important, and you'll hear me talk about that over and over again, and you can ask me more about that. But learning all the aspects, including co-op management education for democratic management, are important. Distrust and excessive competition have also been a barrier. Ideology, especially capitalist and individualistic ideology, are a barrier. Class politics and policies, so policies that are more in favor of capitalism and things like that. And then racism and patriarchy in general, especially for the Black co-ops, have been a barrier. And the history of sabotage has really been, and that's part of why I think we knew so little about the Black co-ops, is because of the range of sabotage against them, both financial and physical sabotage, especially by white competitors and white supremacists who did not want these examples to work, did not want Blacks to show that they could do something together outside of the normal system and outside of the exploitation they were experiencing. And so there's huge racial and economic discrimination against the co-ops. Co-op members even being terrorized and lynched, co-ops being burned down, things like that. In addition to smaller sabotages like banks refusing to give lines of credit to Black co-ops, that kind of thing. Railroads refusing to move their products, that kind of thing. So a huge range of sabotage throughout the history, including up into the 21st century. We can find examples of some of these sabotages, but also still this long legacy of persistence, resistance, and persistence, so that any decade in US history, I can show you where there were some African-American cooperatives being pursued. And as I said, education was the key. So even in the face of all those kind of sabotages, both the internal education of educating the members of the co-op about why they're doing it, how to run a co-op and what they're doing in the co-op, and then the public education for the people outside. It turns out that the co-ops that had stronger community support lasted and survived some of the sabotage. And so making sure your community knows what you're doing, understands, is a part of the project, the program, makes a huge difference. And then for the Black history, they actually use study groups. Most of the co-ops I found, especially in the 20th century, that I knew anything about how they were started with a study group, learning with each other, learning together, learning from other people who had done it before, and moving forward together because of the collective learning. Using literature about co-ops, trying to find those few things that were written by Blacks about co-ops, but also using the traditional co-op literature. And then again, having Black organizations that were saying, let's do co-ops, let's study co-ops, let's do this. And I think I said this already, a response to economic discrimination and marginalization. So let me move to the examples. So one of the other really surprising things for me was to find in the 1880s that co-op development was actually intricately connected to populism and the labor movement, the growing labor movement in the 1880s. So the populism was about small farmers and landowners coming together to demand the same rights as the growing large agribusinesses and things like that, right? And so sort of the little man, the little person movement. Labor unions were obviously about labor, but not just urban labor as we think of now for labor unions, but they were also organizing farm labor. And the most progressive were actually working with small farmers and farm labor, so there wasn't a fight with landowners and laborers, and at least for small farmers. So that was a connection. And then the other interesting thing, right, I just said that the 1880s were a time when the Jim Crow US apartheid started, right? But these labor unions were actually recognizing that white and Black workers needed to stand together. And so again, the progressive labor unions at this period with the Populist Party were very integrated. They did not want to divide labor. They wanted to connect everybody, including women, Black, white, Latinx, et cetera. And so these movements were extremely progressive. And in addition, they were promoting co-op development, worker co-ops in particular, and farm co-ops, because they also realized that the way for labor to really get control and to be in direct control of themselves was through co-ops. So really interesting, by the early 1900s, this coalition of forces is totally torn apart and broken. The labor unions become much more urban and white, right? Populist movement kind of dies, and the co-op movement sort of dies and has to revise itself later. So, but what happened during the 1880s? Richmond, Virginia, not exactly Northern Virginia, but still in the state, a fascinating project happens with the Knights of Labor. They create the Working Men's Reform Party in Richmond. In 1885, they run a political campaign to take control over the city council. They organized Black and white chapters of the Knights of Labor. This is Virginia as Jim Crow is starting, so the white and Black chapters actually can't meet together. They have to meet in separate buildings, in separate rooms, but they're able still to do a joint strategy, which was to promote integrated labor, organized labor, women's work, and co-ops into a strategy. They run this political party as well. They win control over the city council, and their platform was that they wanted the rebuilding of the city hall in Richmond to not be with convict labor, but with unionized, integrated labor and worker co-op construction companies. So they win control of the city council, and they're able to rebuild Richmond City Hall with that kind of a labor force. So really fascinating process, again, where you can see all the politics, the economics, the social, all coming together in one. Also here in Virginia, 1901, the Oddfellows Lodge establishes what's called the Mercantile Cooperative Company in Ruthville, Virginia. They start a co-op grocery and supply store, sell shares at $5 each that people can buy in installments. Since $5 is a little bit steep maybe in 1901, but you could pay it over time so you could afford it. They were able to buy a truck that they then shared with their members to get produce from the farms to the co-op. They actually built a school, an independent Black school. They flourished for about 20 years, which is actually a pretty long time for some of the examples that I found. And the study that I found about this also remarked about how important the whole ecosystem that gets created because of this one co-op existing over those 20 years and all the things that they were able to do. They created this ecosystem of local solidarity and support. It actually helped the Black community to prosper during those 20 years. So when you look at the data for what was happening with Blacks in those years, the Blacks around the region that the co-op was in had a faster rate of growth than the white community, and some of the white community actually moved out of that area, and so there was very strong Black development and Black growth and Black economic stability, and that also led to that area was a place that fought very rigorously when Virginia did not want to desegregate schools in 1954. That area was very strong in fighting back to make sure the schools got desegregated. And the research by this guy, Craig, said that he thinks that whole 20-year history of cooperative activity led to that strength of that Black community. So another interesting example. I wanted to give a DC example because I think there's some DC people here. Great Depression. 1936, there's a co-op, a self-help co-op in Lincoln Heights, DC, which eventually calls itself Cooperative Industries of DC. They had another name earlier, Northeast Co-op, I think. They're a producer co-op of unemployed, unskilled workers and homemakers, so mostly Black women doing sewing, canning, and broom, so pretty much a worker co-op, which was relatively rare in those days. They finally got some federal funding because during FDR's period, there was a self-help grant program out of the Department of Commerce. They finally, after 2 years, got that money that enabled them to buy a farm. So they became what we now would call a hybrid or multi-stakeholder co-op. They had a farm, they had these worker co-ops and consumer co-op in terms of bringing the farm produce to the city and that kind of thing. So another really interesting co-op, again, out of need in the Great Depression. Another Depression-era co-op that was really fascinating is Red Circle Cooperative, again in Richmond. So you see Richmond has this really interesting co-op history. I just recently wrote an article about that I think is coming out in some New Left magazine. I'm not sure it's out yet, but anyway, I highlight what was happening through Virginia's history with Black co-ops. In this case, somebody from the Richmond Urban League had visited a co-op in Gary, Indiana, came back talking about it. So they start their own co-op with a membership drive, an education program. Within a year, they go from 35 members to 125. They did study tours. They went around to other places around the country that had Black co-ops already to learn about them. They were boycotting a grocery store because it wouldn't hire any Blacks and was unfriendly to Black usage. So they actually opened their co-op grocery across the street from the chain grocery store. I think it was an AMP, the biggest chain grocery store branch. And so they literally were in the face of the grocery store that they were boycotting and managed to survive and do better than that grocery store. So they ended up hiring more people than the grocery store. Even though the grocery store finally capitulated and hired a Black person, it wasn't enough. Everyone was already going to the co-op. A co-op had higher sales, more employees, that kind of thing, and were able to give dividends within the first 3 years. Within the first 3 years, give dividends back to their members. So you get the idea. They also served more people than them. They had 400 members by 1940, but they served over 100,000 people every year. And then I think I'm out of time. So Black Panthers, also another group that's not known for their co-ops, but they actually had a whole co-op and community development strategy. It wasn't just a shoot 'em up and self-defense strategy, which most people know about. They used their purpose to defend Blacks against police brutality to actually create a whole system of community supports through co-ops and collective activity. And you'll see they had clothing factories, bakeries, plumbing repair, transportation, et cetera, in addition to the free breakfast programs and free health clinics. And their notion was we need to be building the society that we want while we're fighting against and fighting for liberation and fighting against oppression. We need to be building the kind of communities that we want to see, that we want for the future. So then I also brought a little bit more of a modern example, though they started in 1987. They're still in existence today. Our largest worker co-op, not just our largest Black and brown worker co-op, but the largest worker co-op in the United States is a worker co-op of Black and brown, mostly brown and Black, I guess I should say, home care workers. So they started in the South Bronx, 1987. Employing previously and low-skilled Latina and African-American women in home care. And this project was a project to raise both the quality of home care and the quality of home care work. And the way they understood they could raise both was by using a worker co-op model, right? So making sure that the unskilled women actually got skills, knew how to produce quality care. That also helped them to be competitive enough to get living wages in an industry that didn't give many living wages. And the worker co-op was also a way to give home care workers full-time work when often they were piecing together part-time contingent work. So they also gave them not just good salaries, but benefits, full-time work, career ladder opportunities because you could move up in your training. You could move up in positions in the organization. They actually created a nonprofit training arm so they could do their own training and make sure that the women who wanted additional training, so you could move from a home care provider to a nurse's assistant, to a nurse, and an LPN, to an RN. You could also move up in the organization and become a trainer, or you could move into the organization up into the management of the organization. So you weren't stuck in any one position, which is also rare in home care, right? Usually you just do home care for the rest of your life, pretty much. And then, as we said, giving you benefits, vacation time benefits, and also as an owner, right, they also got dividends. So every profitable year, which is most of the years they've been in existence, they've been able to give almost 25% back on your initial investment. So it's also a wealth building. They also have a retirement fund now and do other wealth building projects. So really fascinating organization. They also have 2 other home care subdivisions. One is for disabilities. So they've got the nonprofit training, they've got the regular home care, they've got disabilities home care, and I'm sorry, I can't think of what the third one is. And then, as I said, and they do all this asset building as well. And managed to be our largest worker co-op in the United States. So again, you can see how co-ops, right, this is why I talk about being an anti-poverty program, right? They can take a job, work, that's the sort of the dregs, the lowest of the low, and build it into something that's meaningful, that workers can control for themselves, that provide all the things that we want a good job to provide, and include, right, democratic participation as well. So just to sum up, right, the important components that we learned from this, right, we need adequate resources, we need adequate management training, we need adequate financing, right? So we need to make sure to give co-op development, whether it's through programs or directly to people who are starting their own co-ops, right? We need to make sure they're provisioned properly and that we understand the kinds of resources that they need. Human energy and enthusiasm, right? I can't tell you how important, normally we talk about a charismatic leader, but that's not what I'm talking about here, because it's not that we want one leader. We want people who all see themselves as leaders. So we want everybody to see themselves as a member leader, right? As a member owner leader, right? And we want everyone to bring that enthusiasm and energy to the co-op. And we've seen, again, co-ops that are able to do that, to maintain, engender and maintain that level of energy and participation, are the ones that do best and last longest. The solidarity and trust among members and community, again, building that sense of camaraderie, trust. A lot of that happens in those study circles and the study groups, right, where you're learning together, you learn to trust each other, to think together, to make decisions together. That, again, is important, and having that solid basis. Some of the co-ops actually start with groups who already know and trust themselves a little bit, but we often don't really know each other unless we're trying to decide about money together. So having that experience of deciding about the money things and the business together, even if we already knew each other or were friendly with each other, all that matters in this case. And then the solidarity and trust with community, as I said briefly, but I can't emphasize enough how important co-op longevity matters. Sorry, how important community solidarity is to co-op longevity. So making sure that co-ops connect with their communities, that the communities know about them, understand what they're doing, and feel connected really matters. And again, the longevity of the co-op matters, is better. The internal education, we talked about study circles, and then public education, right? That communication transparency is so important. Local control and intercooperation, so both the notion that the co-op allows self-determination for its members, right? But then also has intercooperation with other co-ops, with other community activities, with other movements, is also equally important. So again, the internal solidarity and the external connections, ecosystem building also matters. Reaching and incorporating youth, I didn't really talk about that at all, but I also found that extremely fascinating. A lot of co-ops had like youth divisions to make sure that they incorporated and had something for the young people to do. And then also in the late 20th century, I found a lot of examples, sorry, not a lot. I found some fascinating examples about youth-owned co-ops, both in schools and in after school and summer programs, and how important that was for young people to be involved, partly because then they can feed into adult co-ops already knowing how to be a co-op and do a co-op, but also in their own right, the youth co-ops actually help the young people stay in school, be more connected, make some money, be productive in a collective solidarity way. And then leadership roles for women. I also didn't talk about that very much this time, but I have whole lectures where I talk about the role of Black women. It was another surprising thing when I did the research, how involved and how much leadership Black women had in the Black co-ops. Part of it, I think, is because they were already so involved in community development and mutual aid, right? A lot of the mutual aid systems are run and controlled by women. Especially in the Black community. And I think for the co-op movement, it was kind of just natural for Black women to then move from those more informal kinds of collective solidarity things to the more formal co-op structures. And nobody seemed to think it was that weird because they'd already been doing it informally. But really, again, fascinating to see. And some of the co-ops, some of the men in some of the co-ops actually write about how important the women's leadership and the women's participation was to the sustainability of their co-op. So that's another reason why I put it in here, because some of the co-ops actually acknowledged that. It wasn't just what I was noticing. So I think I'm gonna stop there. I would love it if we have questions. I'm happy to answer them and talk about some more stuff or anything I either went over too fast or didn't cover. I'm happy to talk about that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot. I'm thinking about how so many of our dominant narratives about civil rights and Black power in particular don't emphasize or don't really feature the cooperative elements that you've highlighted. And, honestly, your work just highlights that most Black movements throughout our existence in the United States had some sort of cooperative element to it. So can you speak a little bit about why you think that is, just in sort of movement narratives as it relates to the Black community?
That was one of the reasons I did the research and published the book, was because I couldn't understand that either. And then even as I started finding all this information, it kept coming up. So why is the information so hard to find? Why isn't it sort of in the movement histories, right? Right? And so I've got a couple of speculations. I don't have a real answer. I have some speculations about why. So the first one is because of all the sabotage, right? I think we started hiding what we were doing probably from the 1880s. We didn't call them co-ops. We tried not to cause too much attention to them. And we had to go, in the 1880s, they actually literally had to go underground because things were so fierce. And so I think we got used to, like, I used to have people, I guess maybe I still do, but I used to have people come up to me afterwards and say, you know what, when you first started talking about it, I was like, oh no, we don't do that. But the more you talked about it, I realized my aunt and uncle must have been, that thing that they were doing must have been a co-op. I think my parents were in a land sharing thing. They suddenly, right? So once I gave them some words, and I didn't necessarily just say co-op, but that's why I also use economic cooperation. I try to use a lot of different terminology, because a lot of times they didn't call it the co-op, because if they called it the co-op, then someone would come and try to ruin it or smash it or whatever. So even when, like, you talked about it, what you were doing to your kids, you didn't call it the co-op. You just said, we were at the store or whatever. And so it wasn't until they started thinking about how they all went to a meeting to decide what the store should do, or how everybody paid some dues, and then they connected it to the stuff I was talking about. Then they were like, oh yeah, my family was involved in such. So I think that's one of the issues, right? The need for secrecy, and then the use of different terminology that doesn't automatically connect. So that's one. And the undergroundness, right, to protect ourselves. I think also just we live in a capitalist individualist world, and so the ideology of the society that we're in just doesn't allow us to really talk about or highlight It makes us sometimes embarrassed, right? Because that's the other thing, sort of all this cooperation seems like, oh, we had to do that because we couldn't be capitalists, right? Instead of saying we had to do it because we were human beings and wanted a different way to relate to each other economically, right? But the narrative was, oh, we couldn't make capitalism work, and so we're kind of embarrassed about it, right? If you think about it, so many of us, we just want a piece of the pie, the real pie, right? So having a piece of the alternative pie, we're not going to be too excited about that. We're not going to kind of brag about it or anything. So I think that ideology part, and then by the 50s with the red baiting, right, it was actually really, really dangerous politically and economically for Black folks to be connected with anything that reeked of socialism, communism, whatever. And so again, I actually remember Andrew Young got an award from the Federation of Southern Cooperatives about, I don't know how long ago. And I remember he said in his talk that it's almost like they made a conscious decision in the 60s civil rights movements, like he was in the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Association, that if they wanted to get civil rights, political, legal rights, that they shouldn't talk about economics because it was so controversial, so whatever. And then he said, and also the Black community didn't agree, right? Even though I'm sitting here telling you that most of us participate in some kind of informal solidarity, economic cooperation, and a lot of us were in some kind of co-op. But when you talked about it politically, a lot of people didn't necessarily agree that that was the strategy. So he said everyone agreed we needed voting rights, everyone agreed we needed desegregation, or almost everyone agreed, right? And so they went with what everyone agreed to. And even though I found that almost all those civil rights organizations were quietly doing co-op stuff, it's not what they put in the national platform. It's not the stuff they did marches about. It's not, right? But they actually, a lot of them ended up having to do co-op stuff just because they couldn't get in the mainstream economics because of their political activity. And so they still needed to do the co-ops, but they didn't, it wasn't in the platform. So I don't know if that helps you, but that's kind of the stuff I found. And that's also partly why the book is called Collective Courage, because it really took courage to do these things in the face, the mainstream was saying either that co-ops don't work, that co-ops were bad, people were trying to stop you from doing it. And so, yeah.
So sort of building on that last idea, I was wondering in your research, can you speak to the role of government in how it has been disruptive in the formation or the encouragement of co-ops, and particularly as it relates to the infusion of dollars into the community through social services and benefits as an alternative? And then more on a positive side, have you found more recently any examples of governments supporting the creation of cooperatives?
That actually, I could probably do a whole hour lecture on that. So let me figure out what to say in a short period of time, but it's a great question. There's always been a complex relationship between local, state, federal governments and co-ops, especially Black co-ops. And so in some ways, there has been good government support, even though, as we said, we keep saying the ideology and stuff says that the US is against co-ops. But there's some really interesting things. The 1960s, the 1930s, there were actually government programs that gave money to co-ops. In the 60s, the money was to help keep young people in rural areas because there was this huge issue about losing rural populations and stuff. So it was actually money, and they understood that co-ops were a strategy. So like the Federation of Southern Cooperatives was started with first grant money for a meeting from Ford Foundation, but then a huge grant from Department of Economic Opportunity or something, to help keep young people in rural areas, and recognizing that co-op ownership could help do that, right? So there's that kind of, and then again, there was the self-help co-op money from the FDR's administration. There was also a really interesting project for state money. So I'm actually doing the positive side first, but I'll go in and out of both. State money from North Carolina. There was a group of Black co-ops first in Eastern North Carolina that came together and created a coalition. Then they created a statewide Black co-op coalition. And one of the things they wanted to do was to create manuals and co-op education to start Black credit unions and co-ops. They actually were able to get a matching funds from the state, North Carolina State Agricultural Department, in order to do to create their manuals and then to distribute them throughout the state. And they have a fabulous track record. In 8 to 12 years. They went from like 1 Black credit union to 98 or something, and from 2 or 3 co-ops to 30 or something like that. So a really fascinating way that they were able, first with their own self-help and then to use that to leverage to get state money. So there are ways to do that kind of thing that have worked. I don't know other state histories because the only one I have is a dissertation about North Carolina, but I assume there might have been some other things happening in other states like that. So that's like a really fascinating part of how you can get government help. But then we also know, especially with the Pickford case against the U.S. Farm, what's it called? It's one of the farm grant associations, right? And we know that they actually denied Black loans for Blacks to help them own their own land or to start co-ops or be part of a co-op or to get a good loan for a co-op. Either they refused them loans or they gouged them with subprime loans that they couldn't pay and whatever. And actually just a few years ago in the Pickford 1 and 2 cases, they went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, yes, the federal government was guilty of gouging and failing Black farmers. And so they get a couple $1,000s back after all that. So there's definitely ways that the federal government interfered, right? Though a lot of the sabotage I found was really more private companies and private white activity and not so much federal, but we know that there were federal and state things mostly because they were discriminating against Blacks in general. But also they weren't, they had this mixed relationship with whether they thought co-ops were good or not and whether they thought co-ops were communist or not, and it depended on who was in power and that kind of thing. So there's that mixed relationship. The other interesting thing that's happening now that I think you were alluding to or hoping I would talk about is that we're actually getting some municipalities to put money into co-op development. My friend Stacy Sutton from University of Illinois at Chicago wrote a great article a couple of years ago on what she called co-op cities. She found about 10 to 12 municipalities that were seriously putting money, especially into worker co-op development. I think Richmond, California, maybe Richmond, Virginia, New York City, Madison, Wisconsin, Cleveland, Jackson, DC a little bit. I can't remember what the other cities are. But so there's some really interesting legislation and stuff to look at for other places that want to do that. And some great research that was done, especially again about worker co-ops and how they contribute to anti-poverty and our good employment strategies that were helped the city councils to then allocate money. New York City has been able to increase the amount every year. I think Madison put in a lot at the beginning. Cleveland, I think, mostly supported one program, but because that program went pretty well, they've been willing to put a little bit more money. I actually wrote an article in 2018, I guess it was, about the case for reparations, the sabotage against Black co-ops should be part of our case for reparations. And in there, I'm suggesting that we do more of what some of the cities are doing, that all cities, as part of their reparations payment, create these funds that would do co-op development and co-op education, because I think both we need education and we need non-extractive grants and non-extractive lending. And so I put sort of a whole, I thought that was something we could do with the reparations money that would go a long way to getting us out of the crossroads and into the co-op fork of the road. So I don't know. I hope that answered your question.
Hello, Carlos Coleman here. I actually wanted you to speak a little bit more about the transformative potential of cooperatives. You talk a little bit about the barriers and the like, and I myself have been reading a few ethnographies talking about some of the internal politics that might undermine some of their more transformative goals or aspirations. And so I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more to that part and maybe even build upon that relationship with community and ideology as influential factors within their, as I say, transformative potential, not just their growth as a business.
So yeah, I've been arguing. I actually have a lot of articles about the benefits of co-ops. And even though I'm an economist, I'm a political economist, so I understand the importance of political and social benefits, not just the economic and business benefits. And one of the things, not one, several of the things that I noticed when I started looking into this, and then some of the interviews I did with people involved with co-ops and co-op development, was how co-ops allow us to develop in an economic setting, to develop our, what I think I said in the presentation, our full potential as human beings. So what do I mean by that, right? Because co-ops are not just a values-based, group-based enterprise, but because they also require democratic participation, that means that we have to learn by doing when we're in a co-op. And learning by doing really helps us to develop a variety of different kind of skills, right? So in order for co-ops to be run democratically, right, everybody has to have the same information. I don't know if any of you are economists, but one of the things in, one of the critiques we have of capitalism is there's what's called asymmetric information, right? The people with the capital, the people who are the managers know everything, and the people who are the workers know very little, right? But in a co-op, you have to have symmetric information, right? Everybody has to have the same information because everybody's part of the decision making about things, right? So you have to have what's called open books. You have to be able to help develop the budget. You have to see where the money's being spent. You have to know so that you can help make decisions about what to do next, what to do under these circumstances, that kind of thing. So that level of transparency, especially economic transparency, and then the financial literacy that you have to develop as a co-op member, right? Those things, it's not like you leave them at the door of work like we do so much of the other stuff we learn at work. But in a co-op, once you learn financial transparency, once you learn financial literacy and you have transparency in your job, right, you're going to, you know, that's going to spill over into other things, other activities that you're involved in. If you're on the PTA, if you're in other organizations, you're going to start to expect that in those organizations, in your own home, in other things that you do. Even if your partner still works in a capitalist firm, you're going to start asking them, well, didn't they know what's spent here or how this is spent, right? So that transparency really, I think, is and that literacy is transformative. The fact that you get to speak up and get to have a say and learn how to make decisions with other people, right? That means a good co-op also teaches conflict resolution and conflict transformation and collective decision making. Even if your co-op still has like a majority vote, there's still some level of this trying to bring everyone to consensus, talking through an idea, how do you address the conflict, right? And the better co-ops actually really do trainings on that. So again, you get to be a better person in terms of how do you even handle conflict, right? How you handle difference and differences in ideas. Again, you're doing it in your work, right? Which we do for more hours of the day than anything else. And so then when you get home and when you're in other places, you're going to start practicing that too. So I've often argued that our participation in cooperative economics also makes us better human beings, better civic participants. So it changes our own lives, it changes the people around us, and it changes how we deal with the world. And so technically, right, theoretically, ideally, the more of us who are engaged that way, the more we could change the rest of the world around us, right? The more we can expect transparency in the politics, right? The more we can start asking our elected officials about the budgeting stuff, because now we understand budgeting, right? We know how to read those books. We can ask them to see them, and we can talk to them about it, right? So there's all kinds of ways that we can transform ourselves and our societies because of the new capabilities, the new ways of working together, the new ideas we have about how we should work together. Also, being in a co-op, we now know what kinds of policies and programs would help develop more co-ops or would help support our co-op. So we also can get more involved in general in policy advocacy and that kind of thing, because we have a better sense of what we need to create more of the kinds of co-ops and the kind of work situations we want, and we have better capacity to how to articulate it and talk about it, that kind of thing. One of my best examples of transformation is I interviewed a guy who had been in a co-op while he was in prison in Puerto Rico. And so that's one of my new passions, is trying to learn as much as I can about the existing incarcerated worker co-ops around the world. Outside of Puerto Rico, the US doesn't have them yet. But I'm learning about fascinating programs. And one of the things he said was that he was pretty lost. He went to prison when he was about 19. He was pretty lost. But when he joined the co-op, and he eventually became the secretary, because he's actually a poet. The co-op is actually an artist co-op, but he became the secretary because he's a writer and was good with language and that kind of thing. But he talks about how the co-op just changed his whole life. It gave him a mission and a purpose. It gave him a new group of people to work with. It gave him confidence. And it actually changed his behavior so much that his sentence got commuted. I think it was a 30 or 40-year sentence, and I think he only served like 11 years of it or something. So he's another one who talks about just how important it was to have a different way of dealing with people, a different way of making money, a different way of dealing with other people, creating a whole new sense of family, allowing him and others in the co-op to actually give back to their families and to show their families that they were worth something, and to show themselves that they were worth something. So that's, in some ways, that's like the most extreme kind of transformation. Somebody who's in a totally even worse dehumanizing situation than just being a regular worker, right? But being encaged and obviously having all kinds of challenges for why you end up in the cage and all that kind of thing. But then the co-op really helping to rebuild both their economic, their social, their educational side. So I guess I should end there. I was trying to end on some high note, and then I kind of went, so for me, transformation is also one of the important parts of our need and reckoning for why we should be taking that co-op solidarity economics route, because it's so important for us as human beings. As I said, I feel like we've been so alienated from ourselves as human beings. This is a way to regain our humanity in a way that really has proven to be a viable strategy for economic development in addition to human development.